Well, thank you very much for this incredible honor, and excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and especially my 90-year-old mother who came from Enschede to be here with us. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm not even sure where she's sitting, actually. She's right there. So anyway, becoming the recipient of the Treaty of Nijmegen Medal 2018 is without any doubt a great honor. I don't have to tell you that. I'm a little bit humbled by it. And especially as the mayor was saying, this is a special time for Nijmegen as well, being named the capital, or the green capital of Europe. So a very appropriate opportunity. And then to follow the previous laureates like Jacques Delors, or Roberto Eco, Nelly Cruz, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, or the European Court of Human Rights. It is really an amazing honor, and as I said, very humbling. Of course, I'm also delighted that it's Nijmegen, because Nijmegen actually played a very important part in the history of Unilever. It was not difficult to see, actually. It was Anton Jurgens, at that time the Jurgens margarine factory that was in Os, who decided to move to Nijmegen. And that was in the year 1904. Needless to say, he was attracted by the beauty of the city. And then in 1917, actually, the company followed suit. And at that time, it was decided to move the headquarters here from, at that time, the Anton Jurgens Verenigde Fabrieken, which moved from Oost to Nijmegen. In fact, the head office was the former Hotel Keizer Karel, which remained there until about 1928. And then at the same time as Anton moved, he had his brother Frans, who actually acquired a very old estate, which was called Heyendaal. And he asked Charles Estory, the architect, to build a new villa on that. And that villa is actually now the Heyendaal estate, which is part of the Sint Radboud Foundation and acquired by Sint Radboud in 1949. And the Jurgens Villa, which had Kasteeltje, I think is still considered to be the symbol of the university. So many things in common. And I also actually went back to the origins of my family name, which, believe it or not, traces back to Nijmegen to about 1600. But I got a little bit worried because there were two branches of the Polman family. One came out of the register of the prison, and the other one was more of a more noble profession, so to say. I'm still in doubt of which part I actually belong to, although I can guess myself. But it's good to pay for my sins here in the St. Stephen's Church, where we have this celebration. It's actually an obvious opportunity to celebrate the Treaty of Nijmegen, which was 1678, 1679. And it reminds me actually of the French Revolution, because 200 years after the French Revolution, which was 1789, one of the great turning points in history, as you well know, the Chinese Prime Minister at that time was asked about the significance of the event of the French Revolution. And he famously replied at that time that it was too soon to tell. However, you know, I understand that, but however, I also believe that the historic significance here of the Treaty of Nijmegen and the lessons they hold for the future are well understood. The treaty actually represented at that time a crucial moment in European history, the end of a long period of interconnected European conflict. For a brief moment, Nijmegen was actually the center of Europe. Quite surprising, given its size at that time. But that's not to say that the city lacked historical significance on a European scale. In fact, quite the contrary. In medieval times, Charles the Great frequently resided in the city. And the brothers from Limburg, creators of the seminal book of ours, Les Trésors du Duc de Berry, notwithstanding their name, actually came from Nijmegen. Moreover, I heard the reference to it that there is a long-standing debate going on between Nijmegen and Maastricht to prove who's the oldest city in the country. I'm happy to leave that verdict into capable hands. I don't want to get into that. But one thing is clear to me, that given the 3 centuries gap between the treaties of Nijmegen and the Treaty of Maastricht, which was signed in 1992, your claim to fame as being the city with earlier treaties is definitely uncontested. Now, in preparing for today, I was actually impressed to see the treaties featured in many international literatures and on a European and actually on a world history basis, ranging from Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, to Norman Davies' Europe, a History. And rightfully so, because the European peace negotiations between the belligerent parties in the aftermath of 1672, the Dutch year of catastrophe, as you might call it, created one of the highlights of European history, which we still commemorate today. The true legacy of the Treaties of Nijmegen is that it was one of the earliest attempts to achieve peace on a European scale by peaceful means. The power of reason over force, the power of diplomacy over coercion. In fact, the best known relic is a piece of music, the prelude of a Te Deum, which was written by Marc-Antoine Charpentier, which probably is more or better known by many of you as the theme of the European Song Festival contest. The theme and the tune is still connected now to most of the people of Europe as we watch this song festival, and I think it's probably the most lasting legacy of Nijmegen. It must be said, however, that the lessons of the Treaty of Nijmegen proved rather short-lived. Indeed, the historical terms, Europe has been a slow learner. It took centuries of world wars before more lasting forms of cooperation and integration emerged, including the European Coal and Steel Community, as well as later the European Economic Community. Now, this was only possible through visionary leaders like people like Jean Monnet or Robert Schuman, was actually at that time the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs. His name was Jan Willem Beyen. He played a prominent role equally, and it was interesting to see that Beyen actually previously served as a director of Unilever. I'm also pleased to say that Unilever has more generally played a big part in scaling up economic cooperation and integration in Europe. Indeed, the founding of Unilever in 1929 was one of the first large cross-border mergers in the history, bringing together the Dutch Margarine Union at that time with the British Lever Brothers. Now, with the rise of populism across the continent that we are seeing, the European ideal is currently being questioned by many. And it certainly makes the spirit of the Treaties of Nijmegen even more relevant. One can certainly always find reasons to criticize the European Union, but we should never forget these lessons of the past and the true rationale behind the European integration and cooperation, which indeed is bringing peace and prosperity to a formerly shattered continent. That should never be taken for granted. Let me turn from the past or present, if you want to the future for a second, and how we can promote this global peace and prosperity in the spirit of the Treaties of Nijmegen. Certainly the picture today is mixed. As was mentioned before, on the one hand, I do believe that is the best time for people to be born. In fact, the statistics would support that. We are living longer, healthier lives. More children are surviving past the age of 8. Many people more are in education and receiving access to medical care and many other things. In fact, you don't have to feel that being born today is at a bad time in human history. But as was mentioned before as well, it was in fact Dickens who wrote his book in 1859, The Tale of Two Cities, between London and Paris at that time. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We certainly have also a lot of challenges to deal with. I think unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, at this part of the history, many of the factors are coming together that we need to deal with that frankly weren't there before. A rapidly changing world moving south and east, and global governance that hasn't adjusted to the realities of today make it difficult to deal with global issues. Governance is failing us in many places in the world. We see the enormous lifting out of poverty of more people in the history of human mankind than ever done before, but having done that in an unsustainable way, putting enormous pressures on the limited planetary boundaries that we have. We see the anxiety of technologies coming in. On the one hand, offering a lot of possibilities, but increasingly also polarizing society, and yes, increasingly leaving too many people behind as well. It creates some of the challenges we've never dealt with before. The challenges of stubborn poverty in parts of the world, climate change, increasing inequality and conflict, as well as alienation. If we don't tackle these challenges very simply, they have the potential to overwhelm us. And any system, I believe, where too many people feel that they're not participating or where too many people are left behind is ultimately sowing the seeds of its own destruction. And I believe that some of these signs are already visible in some parts of the world. The good news, as Sigrid was already referring to, is that in 2015, September 2015, 193 countries came together in the UN to sign the Sustainable Development Goals, a historic document that I certainly had a lot of energy for when the Secretary General asked me to be part of the high-level panel to help develop these goals. Because in the absence of global governance I referred to before, I felt it probably was the only moral framework that we had globally to make this world function. In fact, it is a simple plan of 17 goals, a plan that simply has as its objective to leave no one behind, to irreversibly eradicate poverty in the next 15 years and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. Indeed, a plan where people are at the center of it, a plan of peace, a plan of prosperity, a plan protecting the planet, and far more importantly, a plan of partnership. Now, it follows what I believe the philosophy is of our company and what we were trying to address already with what we call the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. In our view, free markets and capitalism are worth defending, but it's not worth defending if it lacks its moral base. A brilliant book that always got my attention was from Viktor Frankl, who wrote in 1946, and he was a survivor of Auschwitz, in his book Man's Search of Meaning, where he wrote that at the time that we erected the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, we forgot to erect the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast. I also think it is no surprise that Adam Smith itself, a great economist of his time, wrote his book The Theory of Moral Sentiment about 17 years before he wrote his book The Wealth of Nations. Moral sentiment goes before wealth creation. And the current system, therefore, more than anything, is in desperate need of moving to a different form of responsible capitalism. We've done that before. I always refer to the period in the US, for example, a country with excellence in applying its principles of capitalism. But when Franklin Roosevelt was there, evolving towards the New Deal, as it was called, and evolving that system, created a period of enormous prosperity for many people. And I think we're at that moment again that we need to start bending the curve a little bit and creating that newer form of capitalism. In Unilever, we were very simple with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. We set out a commitment to grow our business, frankly, that had never been done at the scale and size that we're doing this, which is really to decouple our growth from environmental impact and to increase at the same time our overall social impact. Being a company that touches about 2.5 billion people a day and operating in about 190 countries in the world, we set ourselves a goal to improve the livelihoods, if you want to, the health and well-being of 1 billion people. Frankly, no other government can achieve that in the world at that size and scale. What makes the plan unique is that it obviously not only covers all of our operations and all of our factories, but it covers our whole value chain. I'm of the firm opinion that although many companies are outsourcing parts of the value chain, they certainly cannot outsource the responsibility that comes with it. So it's a plan that creates certainly value, but that's a plan that is built with values. And as we were currently being tested by some people who thought that they could enter into some or another form of financial speculation against this wonderful company, I made it very clear that we operate a long-term business model that tries to serve the billions of people out there and not just simply a few billionaires. Likewise, the SDGs, in my opinion, are a call to the same thing. Unfortunately, we're only 5,000 days away from the 15-year plan, so the clock is ticking. The time of political declarations and statements have passed, and the time of implementation at scale and speed have definitely arrived. And that means we have to work together in the spirit of collective partnership that is well captured in goal number 17 of the SDGs. That's a partnership for the common good. That's a partnership based on respect and dignity for everybody. That's a partnership that thinks intergenerational, something we seem to have forgotten in many parts of this world. Now the governments, needless to say, have a key role to play, and I'm delighted that Minister Kaag, obviously having the enormous responsibilities of foreign trade and development, is here with us today as well. The Netherlands actually has been a leading light internationally in promoting the SDGs from the beginning, and we're grateful for that. But it obviously doesn't stop only at national level. Increasingly, it is more important what we do at regional and local levels. That's where the real people live, and that's where most of the action happens. And I'm actually very happy to see that the province of Gelderland, where we are now, has made sustainable food production a priority, not surprisingly, and also has launched a climate initiative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with about 55% by 2030. And that would be well on the target to stay within the 1.5 degrees that are absolutely needed. Several Dutch municipalities have already declared themselves to be global goal cities, or are in the process of doing so, including the city of Nijmegen. So I certainly hope that others will follow. This brings me to the role of companies, because without business, frankly, it will be impossible to deliver these sustainable development goals. And it's very simple to see why. The implementation cost of the Sustainable Development Goals are estimated anywhere to be between $3 and $5 trillion a year. Might sound like a lot of money for each and all of us, but that's about 3 to 5% of the global economy. Unfortunately, the overall money that we have available for overseas development aid is about $160 billion. $160 billion, $3 to $5 trillion. We do have to get the private sector involved to unlock that money, as what people call unlocking with the billions, the trillions that we need to make these goals come alive. In fact, we created the European Business and Sustainable Development Commission under the chairmanship of Lord Malloch Brown, who was at the UN before, where we got 40 of the world's leading CEOs together to look at what the enormous potential could be of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And not surprisingly, we found, looking only at 4 sectors, mobility, food and land use, cities and health and well-being, that it would potentially unlock $12 trillion in the global economy, and equally importantly, create an incremental 380 million jobs at a time, obviously, when we need that enormously. This report was called Better Business, Better World, and I'm very happy to see the goal that we had was to reach about 1,000 CEOs so that they would integrate the Sustainable Development Goals into their corporate strategies. We ended up reaching about 1,800 CEOs, so I think momentum is building there, and more are seeing this as an enormous opportunity and not just as a threat. And the reason that they see this as an enormous opportunity is certainly being helped by the fact that we've waited quite long to do something about it, and we're actually at the point right now where the cost of not acting in many areas is starting to exceed the cost of acting. So even for the ones not driven by a moral compass, it actually starts to make increasingly economic sense to do something about that. In fact, interestingly, I was talking about the cost of the total Sustainable Development Goals being $3 to $5 trillion. Currently, this world, according to the International Monetary Fund, incurs incremental cost of about $5.3 trillion due to climate change alone. For example, air pollution, 8 million people losing their lives prematurely would be a good example. Volatile prices of food that we have. In fact, what is the most bizarre number in this world right now, that the cost that we currently have on conflict prevention and wars in this world is 12 to 14% of the global GDP, while solving the Sustainable Development Goals once more is only 3 to 5% of the GDP. If we cannot solve those dilemmas, I have a hard time seeing ourselves be called the most intelligent species. And yes, there's also a little bit of self-interest for business as well. Take, for example, my industry, the consumer goods industry. If you don't take any action on climate change alone, without any doubt, profits will be wiped out in the next 30 to 50 years, and I personally believe it will happen earlier. especially if you're in the food business. Sustainable models go hand in hand with long-term sustainable businesses. Now, engaging with the SDGs also provides an enormous opportunity to restore trust. Trust is probably the currency we lack most in society today, and it's really undermined the last few years by the bad behavior of some, or I would actually say too many. The latest Edelman Trust Barometer reveals that only 15%, only 15% of the general population believes that the present system is actually working for it, whilst 53% believe that the current economic system is not working for them. Yes, trust is what binds our societies together. So business has to stand up, and business has to speed up and step up. After all, it cannot be a bystander in a system that gives it life in the first place. People rightfully expect business to be an agent for change. In fact, on the positive side, more than 60% of the population believe that companies can take action to increase profitability, but also at the same time improving economic and social conditions. People don't have a problem with that conflict, and I would even argue you need one to make the others possible. Now, many Dutch companies are already leading the way by adopting sustainable growth models aimed at long-term value creation and by playing an advocacy role. We created here the Dutch Sustainable Growth Coalition, for example, under the capable leadership of Jan-Peter Balkenende, our former Prime Minister. And it has put SDGs at the heart of the Dutch government policy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in the 17th century, and at the time of signing the Treaty of Nijmegen, the Netherlands was famous for its VOC mentality. Now, I hope that our country's attitude in the 21st century will be remembered by later generations as having been the era of another sort, of the Dutch SDG mentality. Because our country has so much to offer. Partnership, as I mentioned, are crucial to make the SDGs happen. The Dutch are well known for their capacity to closely work together, both within the public as well as private domain, as well as in public-private partnerships. The 9 Dutch top sectors, including the top sector agri-food and life science and health, are actually leading in the world and serve as great examples, in my opinion, of successful partnerships. The Netherlands indeed can make a significant contribution on the world stage, whilst at the same time growing its own economy, based on the motto of global challenges but Dutch solutions. At Unilever, we will continue to focus on those SDGs where we can make the biggest differences, including the need to change our global food and land use system. For example, through the Food and Land Use Coalition, which I actually have the honor of chairing, we are addressing the issues through public-private partnership. The objective here is very simple: to ensure that we have sustainable and nutritious food, create livelihoods, and at the same time combat climate change. Our food chain probably is one of the chains that we've created that is the most broken in the world. We cut down the forests as if we have an abundance of it, cutting the lungs of the world. We produce the food in an unsustainable way, create livelihoods that are deplorable for many, stunting for 160 million people, food waste, 30 to 40% of what we do, and on the other side of the chain, we are about to create the biggest epidemic that the world has ever seen with diabetes 2 as a result of obesity. So it needs action, and that's why we've created this alliance to work this end-to-end. Next to companies and the role of companies, we should not underestimate the role of the financial markets or investors. They really need to go back to serving society and not serving themselves, and that still requires quite a lot of transition or understanding by some. I'm very encouraged, though, by the call of some of the people in the financial sector, notably BlackRock and others, which are some of the biggest asset management funds, which are starting to push, finally, may I say, for longer-term value creation and getting out of this myopic focus on the short term. If we can get the financial markets to move, as we also saw on climate change, then that's a real accelerator also for the rest of the business sectors to move. I don't want to miss this opportunity either to point out the role of academia here. They have definitely a higher credibility on the trust scale than many of the other institutions that we deal with right now in the world, and they are absolutely crucial for making these sustainable development goals come alive. Most importantly, obviously, with science-based targets. More important than today is the statement from former Senator Mohan in the US that said very clearly that although everyone is entitled to his own opinions, but not to his own facts. There are some people in this world that try to bend the facts a little bit, and especially in the area of climate change, it is very important that we do that on science-based targets. And these are some of the areas where the academic community can absolutely play a key role. I'm therefore very pleased to see that in the Netherlands also, the Dutch National Science Agenda has closely linked its research priorities with these societal challenges that we talk about, thereby making it an important contribution, I believe, to achieving these global goals. So let me conclude. Everyone's contribution here is much needed. More than ever, it's about that partnership. Doing the same thing again that we did before is not going to get us where we want to be. A little bit the definition of Einstein's insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is not going to happen. We need to work together on a different basis with a partnership for the common good. We need to work together by putting the interest of others ahead of our own, by having more purpose-driven models, more longer term, and certainly built on an enormous partnership. I believe that momentum is building. There are many positive signs actually. Increasingly, the consumers in all of the markets in the world want to buy from sustainable or responsible companies, well over 50% of the consumer base, the way we see it. Increasing numbers of businesses are embedding things like the Sustainable Development Goals into their strategies. Encouragingly, 85% of the graduates of schools now want to work for purpose-driven companies. Financial markets are starting to move, and we've actually seen the first sustainable development bonds coming out, green bond market moving up, $35 trillion of money under management asking for a price on carbon. And then closer to home, we see the Dutch government has agreed ambitious climate change policies to live up to the obligations that we signed up to under the Paris Agreement. Arguably, all the SDGs actually directly relate to climate change, in my opinion, be it food security, be it deforestation, be it renewable energy, or be it sustainable consumption. In fact, it's not surprising, because human development and climate change are probably two sides of the same coin. And yes, by not addressing the issue of climate change, it are indeed the poorest and often women and children that pay the highest price of our failures to act. In 1968, the ecologist Garrett Hardin actually coined the term tragedy of the commons. He used it to describe a situation in which individual users, acting according to their own personal perceived self-interest, are in fact behaving contrary to the common good by depleting scarce resources. I hope that I've been able to convey to you that the SDGs can actually reverse what I call the tragedy of the commons. Indeed, they have the potential to become the remedy of the commons. By jointly implementing the global goals, we can save the planet and human mankind. What could be more meaningful and a hopeful message for the future than that? It indeed means being driven by a deeper sense of purpose and putting the interest of others above our own. For some, greed might be good, but I've discovered long ago that generosity is always better. And on that note, let me just close by expressing once more my sincere gratitude to the Mayor and the City of Nijmegen, the Radboud University, and NXP Semi-Computers for the honor once more to receive this wonderful recognition. Thank you very much.